So if a single tech company or, say, a massive telecom giant suddenly captured, I don't know, 70% of an entire national market, we all know exactly what would happen.
Oh, yeah, the alarms would just absolutely blare.
Right. Government regulators would haul the executives into some sterile courtroom. They'd pore over their financial spreadsheets and just launch these massive antitrust investigations. Because in a domestic economy, a monopoly is, it's universally treated as a structural systemic threat.
Exactly. I mean, it's bad for consumers, it stifles innovation, and governments will step in to physically break those companies up if they have to. We just accept this as a basic, fundamental rule of capitalism.
We do. But here is the massive glaring contradiction we are unpacking today in this deep dive. If a single country, not a company, a country captures 70% of a critical global supply chain,
Say, like, the manufacturing of advanced microchips.
right, or refining rare earth metals, if a country does that, it doesn't trigger an antitrust investigation. It triggers admiration. It creates this massive global dependency. And, I mean, most surprisingly, it triggers absolute silence from international law.
It really is a fascinating double standard, you know. We relentlessly police monopolies within our own borders because we understand the danger of concentrated power, yet we completely allow sovereign nations to dictate the terms of the entire global economy using those exact same monopolistic tactics.
And that is the core tension we are exploring today. We are taking you, the listener, through an incredibly provocative framework proposed in a detailed piece by Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
And for some quick context on the source, the author actually notes he was Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City.
Yeah, that's a really interesting detail. The piece is titled, When a Country Becomes a Monopoly, Why the Global Economy Needs Automatic Antitrust Rules. Now, before we get too deep into the actual mechanics of this, I do want to set a quick ground rule for you.
Right, the disclaimer.
Yeah, we have to do it. We are going to be exploring some highly complex, very politically charged concepts today regarding global trade, geopolitical power, economics. Our role here is strictly to act as your impartial guides.
Exactly. We aren't taking sides, we aren't endorsing these viewpoints as our own, and we definitely aren't making political statements.
Our goal is simply to pull apart the author's arguments, look at how they function, and sort of see what a world run by these rules would actually look like.
And those arguments really require a lot of rigorous stress testing, because the author is essentially suggesting we tear down the entire current architecture of international trade and build something completely unprecedented.
Okay, let's unpack this. He starts by attacking what he calls the illusion of the free market, right?
Yes, because, I mean, we love that phrase, don't we? The free market.
We really do.
Yeah.
We love to describe the modern global economy as this beautifully balanced, totally frictionless system where nations just trade based on comparative advantage. Country A is great at growing wheat. Country B is great at making shoes. They trade, and everybody wins.
Right, the textbook definition. But the text argues that at the highest levels of critical technology, it doesn't behave like a free market at all. It behaves like a power market.
A power market. It's a very deliberate term.
It is, because in a classic free market, you can always take your business elsewhere. That's the whole point. But in a power market, when one nation accumulates just overwhelming dominance in a specific life-sustaining industry, the rest of the world loses the ability to be an equal trading partner.
They just become structurally dependent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The author describes this current state of affairs as strategic hostage conditions.
Strategic hostage conditions. That is such a heavy, almost aggressive phrase. But think about what it actually feels like for a second. Remember a few years ago when that massive container ship, the Ever Given, got stuck in the Suez Canal?
Oh, wow. Yeah. The global panic was instant.
Right. For a week, just a pure accident halted a massive percentage of global trade. Supply chains just completely froze. Now imagine that anxiety, but instead of an accident, it's deliberate. Imagine you live in a town that has exactly one grocery store, and you are entirely dependent on it to feed your family. If the owner raises prices, you pay. But more terrifyingly, if the owner decides they don't like your politics.
Or they want you to vote a certain way in the town council.
Exactly. They can just threaten to lock the doors. You don't just go hungry. You have to fundamentally change your behavior to survive.
That analogy really gets right to the heart of the author's point, because the leverage in that situation is so absolute that the dominant supplier doesn't even need to make an explicit threat.
Right. The store owner doesn't have to verbally blackmail you?
No. The mere possibility that they could cut off your food supply dictates your actions. On a geopolitical scale, when a nation controls the supply of something existential, that dependency itself becomes a weapon.
Just knowing they hold the keys forces you to comply.
Yes. And the author argues that this kind of unstated leverage inevitably becomes foreign policy. A dominant nation's diplomatic requests are, well, they're always backed by the silent threat of economic strangulation.
But I want to push back on this right out of the gate, especially for anyone listening who leans heavily into free market capitalism.
Sure.
Because the immediate counter-argument you'd hear is, wait, isn't this dominance just the reward for being the most efficient player in the game?
The meritocracy argument.
Right. If a nation pours resources into R&D, works harder, and figures out how to make the best, cheapest solar panels on Earth, shouldn't they dominate the market? Like, why are we framing their success as a hostage situation instead of just a victory for human efficiency?
What's fascinating here is that that is the exact defense that dominant nations use. But the author systematically dismantles it.
How so?
Well, the text argues that when we see a single country holding 70 or 80% of a global market, that dominance is almost never the result of pure free market efficiency or genuine merit.
So it's not a level playing field.
Not at all. It is usually the result of deliberate state-sponsored market manipulation.
So it's not just that they built a better mousetrap. They essentially rigged the game to ensure nobody else could even buy the materials to build a mousetrap.
Precisely. The author points out that these monopolies are built on a foundation of unfair advantages that completely violate the spirit of a free market.
Okay, let's go through these because there are 7 of them listed, right?
Yeah, let's start with heavy state subsidies.
Yeah.
And we aren't talking about a local mayor giving a tax break to a factory.
Right.
We are talking about sovereign governments pouring tens of billions of dollars directly into a specific sector, allowing their domestic companies to operate at massive losses for a decade. A private company in a truly free market just cannot compete with a rival that is entirely bankrolled by a national treasury.
Because the private company actually has to turn a profit to survive, whereas the state-backed company only has to survive long enough to bankrupt the private company.
Exactly.
Which leads right into the second advantage, the concept of dumping, right? I was reading the author's breakdown of dumping strategies, and it is just a brutal tactic.
It really is economic warfare disguised as commerce. Dumping is when that state-backed company takes its heavily subsidized products and floods a foreign market, selling them far below the actual cost of production.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that just so you can see how insidious this is. Let's say it costs $100 to manufacture a solar panel, right?
Okay.
A dominant nation will flood the global market with panels priced at $40. They are literally losing $60 on every single panel. But their government covers the loss.
Right, the state subsidy kicks in.
Meanwhile, all the competing factories in other countries who have to sell at $100 just to break even, they instantly lose all their customers. They go bankrupt, they close their doors, lay off their workers, and sell off their equipment.
And the moment that domestic competition is entirely eradicated, the dominant nation basically owns the market.
And what happens next? They immediately jack the price up to $150?
Exactly. The initial financial loss was just an investment in securing a permanent monopoly. It completely shatters the illusion of the free market.
It really does. What's the third unfair advantage?
Currency manipulation. That's where a state artificially depresses the value of its own money, so its exports are impossibly cheap for other countries to buy.
So even if their manufacturing isn't actually better, the math just makes it impossible for anyone else to compete.
Right. Then you have non-transparent labor practices. This is where a lack of worker safety or independent unions drives costs down to levels that a regulated democracy legally cannot match.
Because in a regulated democracy, you have to pay minimum wage, provide safe working conditions, healthcare, all of which costs money.
Exactly. And the fifth factor is massive environmental cost externalization.
Oh, this one is huge.
Processing advanced materials, like the rare earth elements used in our smartphones and electric vehicles, is an incredibly toxic process. It creates radioactive waste and heavy metal pollution.
So if a country is willing to decimate its own rivers and poison its own air to keep processing costs near absolute zero,
They gain a massive pricing advantage on the global market, but they aren't actually being more efficient.
they are just refusing to pay the bill for the environmental cleanup. They're offloading the true cost of production onto their citizens' lungs and water supply.
Exactly. Then there's the sixth factor, which is the sheer hypocrisy in trade policy. The classic rules for thee but not for me approach.
Protectionism.
Yes, fierce protectionism at home combined with demanding absolute openness abroad. A nation might legally bar foreign companies from competing within its own borders to nurture its infant industries, but simultaneously use global trade organizations to demand unrestricted access to everyone else's markets.
Wow. And the final factor?
Government-directed industrial planning, taking all these tools, subsidies, dumping, currency controls, labor exploitation, environmental destruction, and protectionism, and combining them into one centralized, long-term state strategy.
So when you look at all 7 of those, the result isn't a free market victory, it is an engineered monopoly.
Completely engineered. And if we accept the author's premise that these national monopolies are artificially constructed rather than organically earned, we have to look at how they actually weaponize that power.
Right. And the text does this really interesting thing where it takes the 5 classic dangers of a corporate monopoly and maps them directly onto the geopolitical stage.
It's a great translation exercise. Think about why we broke up Standard Oil or AT&T domestically. The first danger of a domestic monopoly is price manipulation. A corporation will just gouge consumers because they have nowhere else to go.
But geopolitically, the author says this looks like the dumping we just talked about. It's not just about gouging, it's about dictating the global price floor to ensure no emerging economy can even afford to start their own competing industry. The price itself becomes a barrier to entry.
Exactly. The second domestic danger is a corporation blocking competitors from the supply chain. On a global scale, the author translates this to a nation restricting exports during a political dispute.
Give me an example of that.
Say a dominant country controls the raw materials your aerospace industry needs, and your government publicly criticizes their human rights record. They just halt the shipments. They starve your factories of inputs until you apologize or walk back your statement.
Wow. Which bleeds right into the third danger, influencing politics.
Right. A massive corporation might hire lobbyists to sway a senator, right?
Right.
But what does a monopoly nation do?
A monopoly nation demands total political alignment. They leverage their supply chain to force votes at the United Nations, for example.
Exactly. They might say, if you want the antibiotics your hospitals desperately need, or the telecommunications equipment your infrastructure relies on, you must publicly support our territorial claims.
The economic dominance completely subjugates the dependent nation's sovereignty.
That's the strategic hostage condition in full effect. They decide who gets access, which is the fourth danger.
Deciding access.
Yes. Access to the future of technology isn't based on your ability to innovate or pay. It's based entirely on your geopolitical subservience.
That is wild. And the fifth corporate danger the author maps out is the death of innovation. Because, if a company has no rivals, it just stops inventing.
Globally, the text frames this as the dominant nation forcing the world into its proprietary standards.
Like what?
Think about 5G or future telecom networks. If one country builds all the infrastructure globally, they force every other nation to use their underlying code and hardware protocols. They lock the world into a closed system that only they know how to update, monitor, or fix.
Effectively stifling any alternative developmental paths from other countries.
Exactly.
Left pause here and connect this directly to you, the listener, because it's easy to get lost in all this macroeconomic theory, but the author is making a very grounded point here.
Right.
Trade without balance isn't just an abstract economic inefficiency. Trade without balance becomes dependency. And in the 21st century, dependency is the exact opposite of national security.
That's so crucial. We are so conditioned to think of global conflict in 20th century terms. Tanks rolling across borders, naval blockades, military alliances.
Treaties in general.
Yeah, exactly. But the author's thesis is that the battlefield has fundamentally shifted. The ultimate weapon today isn't a tariff, it isn't a traditional economic sanction, and it certainly isn't a standing army.
The ultimate weapon is supply chain control.
Yes. If you control the choke points, you don't need to fire a single bullet to bring a rival to its knees.
And this is where the author gets highly specific. The text outlines what it calls the global commons. These are the specific existential sectors that simply cannot be allowed to fall into the hands of a single nation.
And it's important to note here, the author isn't talking about consumer goods.
Right.
Nobody is proposing a global antitrust intervention because one country makes 90% of the world's plastic toys or, exports the most coffee. The focus is entirely on the foundational pillars of modern human civilization.
I was looking at this list of sectors, and it literally reads like the central nervous system of the modern world.
It does.
We're talking about semiconductors and the incredibly complex chip-making equipment required to make them, rare earth extraction, the massive AI training compute infrastructure, batteries and lithium processing, solar and renewables, pharmaceuticals, specifically vaccines and active ingredients,
Right.
advanced materials like graphene and aerospace alloys, defense electronics, quantum computing, and telecom networks like satellite internet.
Look at the sheer gravity of those sectors. If a single nation achieves absolute dominance over semiconductors and AI compute, they effectively own the future of technological advancement, period.
Wow. Yeah.
If they monopolize rare earths and batteries, they hold a veto over the entire global transition away from fossil fuels. If they control pharmaceutical supply chains, they hold the health and survival of billions of people hostage during a global health crisis.
It is genuinely terrifying when you lay it out like that. But realistically, governments aren't completely ignorant to this, right? We constantly hear politicians talking about de-risking or reshoring manufacturing back home or friend-shoring it to allied nations.
No, the buzzwords.
Right. So why aren't those strategies enough? Aren't they already addressing the author's concerns?
The author is highly critical of those strategies, actually. He argues that they are hopelessly fragmented and deeply flawed because they rely entirely on shifting political alliances.
Well, friend-shoring just means you are trading one dependency for another based on who happens to be your ally today. But geopolitical winds change. Allies become rivals.
That's true.
The author argues that relying on temporary political alignments does not solve the structural danger of a monopoly. What the global economy actually needs is a cold, systematic, rule-based approach.
An approach that triggers automatically, regardless of whether the monopoly is held by your best friend or your worst enemy.
Exactly. Think about domestic antitrust law. It's designed to be blind.
Right.
If a corporation crosses a mathematical threshold of market dominance, the legal mechanisms kick in automatically. It doesn't matter how friendly the CEO is with the current administration.
So the author's radical proposition is that we need that exact same mathematical objectivity enforced on the global stage.
Yes. And this brings us to the absolute core of the text, the mechanism itself.
Okay, here we go.
The author proposes a new global antitrust framework built on strict, escalating market share triggers. I want us to really pull these apart because the friction here is massive. The first threshold the author proposes is a 40% market share in one of those critical sectors. So what happens when a country hits 40%?
At 40% global market share, the proposal triggers mandatory monitoring and transparency requirements.
Okay.
The dominant nation would be legally obligated to open its books to an international body. They would have to provide clear, verifiable data on their production capacity, the scale of their state subsidies, and their supply chain flows.
I have to jump in here because even at this lowest threshold, the political friction is enormous. You are asking sovereign nations, many of which treat their industrial capacity as highly classified state secrets, to just hand over their internal data to an international committee.
That's a huge ask.
How does the author expect any nation to actually agree to that kind of vulnerability?
The author acknowledges the difficulty, for sure, but frames it as a necessary condition for participating in the global market. Think about the banking sector after the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, that's a good parallel.
Banks didn't want to open their books to stress tests, but the global economy demanded it because the alternative was systemic collapse.
Right.
The author argues that a country controlling 40% of the world's semiconductors is just as systemically critical as a massive global bank. Transparency is simply the price of admission.
Okay, so 40% is the "we are watching you closely" phase. What happens when they cross the 50% threshold?
At 50%, the framework triggers global diversification incentives.
Meaning what?
This is where the international community proactively intervenes to artificially stimulate competition. If country A hits 50%, a global coalition would automatically activate shared subsidies, relax tariffs, or tax benefits specifically designed to prop up emerging alternative suppliers in countries B, C, and D.
So instead of trying to punish the leader, you collectively inject adrenaline into the runners-up to prevent the leader from running away with the entire market.
Exactly.
But what if that fails? What if the dominant nation's momentum is just too strong and they hit 60% market share?
This is where the rules become intensely interventionist. At 60%, the author mandates mandatory licensing and joint ventures.
Wow.
The dominant country would be legally required to license their critical proprietary technology to foreign manufacturers at internationally regulated fair prices. Or they would be forced to partner with foreign entities to ensure the physical production isn't entirely bottlenecked within their own borders.
And then we reach the nuclear option,
The big one.
the 70% market share. Here's where it gets really interesting.
At 70%, the dominant nation faces absolute technology transfer obligations and distributed production mandates.
I am going to push back incredibly hard on this because this sounds wildly controversial.
Oh, it is.
If a domestic company becomes a monopoly, the government can physically break it up. You chop Standard Oil into dozens of smaller competing companies, but you cannot partition a sovereign nation.
You can't just break up a country because their factories are too efficient.
Right, so the author's equivalent of breaking them up is forcing them to surrender their technology. But let's be real, to a lot of people, mandatory technology transfer sounds exactly like state-sanctioned theft.
It does.
It sounds like punishing success by forcing the winner to just hand their blueprints over to the losers. How does the author legitimate this?
It is arguably the most sensitive part of the proposal, and the text is extremely careful to define what technology transfer actually means in this framework. The author emphatically rejects the idea that this is piracy, confiscation, or, the engineered collapse of the dominant nation's industry.
So if it's not theft, what are the actual mechanics? How do you force a transfer of knowledge without it being confiscatory?
The goal is establishing a legal architecture where critical knowledge simply cannot remain geographically concentrated, and the author outlines 6 specific tools to execute this.
Okay, let's go through them.
The first is mandatory patent pooling for essential technologies.
Explain how that works practically. If I'm a nation that just invented a revolutionary new solid-state battery, what happens to my patent?
Instead of locking that patent in a vault for 20 years to maintain an absolute monopoly, the patent is placed into a regulated global registry.
Okay.
Other nations can then access the underlying chemistry and engineering to build their own domestic capacity.
But they don't get it for free, right?
No, absolutely not. And that is the crucial second tool: licensing agreements at regulated fair prices.
So I still get paid.
Yes, the developing nation that accesses your battery patent still has to pay you royalties. You still generate massive revenue from your invention. But what you cannot do is outright refuse to license it. And you cannot charge an extortionate astronomical price designed to deliberately keep competitors out of the market.
So an international tribunal would set a price that ensures you are highly compensated, but the technology remains actually accessible.
Exactly.
Got it. What's the third tool?
Mandatory joint manufacturing projects in developing nations.
So instead of the dominant country building its 15th megafactory inside its own borders, it is legally required to co-build that factory in a developing nation, physically moving the supply chain nodes across the map.
Exactly. You are forcing the physical infrastructure to spread out.
Okay, and the fourth tool?
The fourth tool addresses the software and infrastructure side, open standards instead of proprietary lock-in.
Like the 5G example from earlier?
Right. If we are talking about a new global telecom network, the underlying code must be open source or heavily standardized so any country can manufacture compatible routers and receivers. You cannot force the world to use a black box system that only you control.
That makes sense. The fifth tool is fascinating to me. Global production quotas requiring distributed capacity.
This is a very blunt instrument.
Yeah, how does that work?
It means the international community says, look, we recognize you have the capacity to produce 90% of the world's solar panels, but for the sake of global security, you are legally capped at exporting 60%.
Wow, you just can't sell the rest.
Right. The rest of the world must figure out how to manufacture the remaining 40% themselves.
You are artificially forcing the market to diversify its physical footprint. But wait, if you force poorer countries to suddenly build advanced factories to make up that 40% gap, who pays for it?
Which brings us perfectly to the sixth tool: international funding for replication.
Okay.
The global community would have to create a massive financial fund to underwrite the cost of replicating these incredibly expensive supply chains in new geographies.
So when you look at all 6 of these tools together, the patent pools, the fair price licensing, the joint ventures, open standards quotas, and global funding, The overarching philosophy really becomes clear.
Yes.
The goal is not to destroy the economic leadership of the dominant country.
No, not at all.
The goal is purely to generate redundancy.
Redundancy. That is the magic word here.
The author frames this entire massive disruption of the global economy not as a punishment, but as an insurance policy for human civilization. And there is this engineering analogy in the text that I think just perfectly illustrates why this is necessary.
Your plane engine analogy.
Yes. The author points out that we never build airplanes with only one engine, right? No matter how incredibly reliable that single engine is, we always have a backup. We don't build massive hospital data centers without backup diesel generators.
We force massive financial institutions to undergo rigorous stress tests to prove they won't trigger a global depression if the housing market dips.
Exactly. We engineer redundancy into every single critical system that sustains human life, yet somehow, when it comes to the global physical economy,
We have optimized it around a few single, highly concentrated nodes with zero backup plan.
zero.
And that extreme optimization is driven purely by the pursuit of the lowest possible cost. I mean, Wall Street and corporate boards have spent the last 40 years demanding just-in-time manufacturing.
Eliminating warehouses, cutting redundancies.
Right, hyper-concentrating production, wherever labor and environmental laws happen to be the cheapest. But, as the author argues, when you optimize entirely for cost, you completely sacrifice resilience.
And we saw exactly how fragile that optimization was during the pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. If a single nation produces 80% of a critical pharmaceutical precursor, and that nation experiences a severe localized crisis,
Whether it's an earthquake, a strict pandemic lockdown, or a sudden decision to go to war,
the entire global healthcare system goes into cardiac arrest. You have doctors in completely unaffected countries unable to perform surgeries because a factory 6,000 miles away shut down.
but if that production capacity had been distributed across 10 different nations through mandatory technology transfer,
The global system can absorb the shock.
redundancy equals stability.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is arguing that we need to move away from just-in-time supply chains and legally mandate just-in-case supply chains for the global commons.
It makes complete logical sense from a systems engineering perspective. But returning to the geopolitical reality for a second, there is a massive counterargument that critics will absolutely weaponize against this proposal.
Let me guess. The innovation defense.
You got it. The idea that forcing technology transfer will instantly kill the incentive to invent anything new.
It's the most common defense.
Right. Think about it from the perspective of a national leader. If my country invests $1 trillion of taxpayer money into research and development, and our scientists work grueling hours for 2 decades to achieve a massive breakthrough in quantum computing.
Why would we ever do that if we know we have to share it?
Exactly. If we know that the moment we become globally successful and hit 70%, we are legally required to hand the blueprints over to our rivals. If global leadership results in forced sharing, why would anyone try to lead?
It is a totally valid question, but the author attacks it head-on by pointing out a fundamental misunderstanding of the proposal. Antitrust regulation does not confiscate value.
How so? If they have to share the tech, don't they lose their edge?
Not at all. The dominant country under this framework still profits enormously. First, they still capture the massive first-mover advantage, which in advanced manufacturing is incredibly lucrative.
Right.
They still collect billions in licensing fees and royalties from the patent pools. They still generate immense export revenue up to that 60 or 70% threshold.
Yeah.
And they still wield massive geopolitical prestige as the pioneer of the technology.
So, to synthesize the author's defense here,
Right.
you are allowed to be wildly successful. You are allowed to make an absolute fortune. You are allowed to be the most prestigious technological power on Earth.
You just aren't allowed to become a singular existential choke point.
You get to be the biggest player. You just cannot engineer a reality where you are the only player.
Precisely. And the author draws a brilliant parallel to domestic history to prove that this doesn't actually kill innovation. Look at the breakup of AT&T and the Bell system in the United States.
Oh, right, because AT&T had a total, literal monopoly on telecommunications.
And when the government stepped in and forced them to license their patents, including the foundational patents for the transistor, by the way, it didn't kill innovation. It birthed the entire modern semiconductor industry.
It basically created Silicon Valley.
Exactly. When monopolies are forced to share the foundational building blocks, it unleashes a wave of secondary innovation across the broader market.
Because competition is preserved? If a monopoly controls everything, they can become lazy. They stop inventing because they have no rivals to push them.
But if they are forced to license their technology, suddenly there are hungry emerging competitors nipping at their heels.
And the original leader is forced to keep inventing the next generation of tech just to stay ahead. So the author's thesis is that competition thrives under regulation and therefore innovation actually accelerates.
It's a really compelling historical argument.
Mm.
But beyond stabilizing the top tier of global superpowers, the author suggests this framework would do something even more profound.
What's that?
It would completely rewrite the fate of the developing world.
Ah, yes. This was the part of the text that felt truly visionary to me. Let's dig into the historical trap that the Global South has been stuck in for centuries and how this antitrust framework could theoretically break it.
Well, the current global economic dynamic traps developing nations in a very specific, low-value role.
The extraction rule.
Yes, they are the providers of raw materials, mining the lithium, extracting the copper, harvesting the rubber, and they provide the ultra-cheap labor for low-tier basic assembly.
But they never capture the actual economic value of the resources they are pulling out of their own ground.
Exactly. They export thousands of tons of raw lithium for pennies, and then they are forced to import the finished high-tech electric vehicles or grid batteries back from the dominant nations for tens of thousands of dollars.
It's a vicious cycle.
And because of this cycle, they never acquire the advanced engineering knowledge base or the complex manufacturing capacity required to climb the industrial ladder. They are locked in a state of permanent structural inequality.
But if we lived in a world governed by the author's automatic antitrust mechanisms, if dominant nations hitting that 70% threshold were legally mandated to engage in joint ventures and patent pooling.
Then the developing world finally gains the one resource they are currently denied.
Yeah.
True advanced industrial capability. The knowledge actually flows across borders by law.
The author paints this incredible regional map of what the future could look like. Imagine the African continent not just exporting raw, unrefined rare earths, but utilizing mandatory tech transfers to build its own highly advanced, robust pharmaceutical manufacturing hubs.
Right.
Imagine South Asia legally acquiring the licenses to build out its own end-to-end semiconductor supply chains, completely freeing itself from import dependency. Imagine Latin America developing massive clean energy manufacturing sectors.
Or Southeast Asia building state-of-the-art capacity for advanced composite materials. It completely reframes how we view international development. Right now, technology transfer is often treated as foreign charity. A wealthy nation might build a single hospital or a basic factory in a developing nation as a diplomatic goodwill gesture.
Or in exchange for resource rights.
Exactly. But under the author's proposal, transferring this knowledge isn't charity at all. It becomes a legal, systemic necessity for the survival of the global economy.
The wealthy nations must help the developing nations industrialize because international law says the wealthy nations are no longer permitted to hoard the world's production capacity.
The author is arguing for an engineered, multipolar industrial world, which would inherently be more prosperous, more resilient, and far less prone to the kind of geopolitical blackmail we see today.
It is an incredibly empowering, almost utopian vision, but it brings us crashing into a monumental practical hurdle.
The enforcement.
The friction of reality. How on earth do you enforce this? You cannot just politely ask a dominant superpower to surrender its ultimate leverage.
And this is where the author lays out the institutional blueprint for making this a reality. He proposes a new treaty, a Global Competition and Supply Chain Stability Treaty.
A brand new international treaty. Mechanically speaking, how does the author actually envision this treaty functioning?
The treaty serves as the central enforcement mechanism, and it would need to do several highly specific things. First, it would legally define and constantly update the list of sectors that qualify as the strategic global commons.
Right, the semiconductors, the AI compute, the pharma.
Exactly. Second, it would legally bind signatory nations to those specific market share thresholds, the 40, 50, 60, and 70% triggers.
So all the nations agree on the mathematical boundaries before anyone actually crosses them?
Yes, establishing the rules of the game in advance. Third, the treaty would dictate the exact legal forms of technology transfer required at each threshold.
Okay, what's fourth?
Fourth, and this addresses the innovation debate we had earlier, it would establish the international tribunals that protect intellectual property and calculate those regulated fair prices for mandatory licensing.
To make sure the inventors still get paid?
Right. Fifth, it would create an independent, heavily empowered monitoring body to verify compliance.
Like what?
Think of the IAEA inspectors who verify nuclear enrichment facilities, but for global supply chains.
Oh, wow. That would be a massive agency. And sixth, it has to have teeth, right? It has to have severe penalties.
It absolutely does. The treaty must establish severe pre-agreed collective penalties for any nation that hits a monopoly threshold and refuses to comply with the transfer mandates.
Like what kind of penalties?
We are talking about united global tariffs instantly applied by all other signatories,
Ooh.
or severely restricted access to the rest of the global market.
But asking sovereign nations to sign a treaty that forces them to surrender control of their crown jewel industries. I mean, that is an astronomical ask. How does the author philosophically justify this level of heavy-handed global governance to nations that are, fiercely protective of their sovereignty?
The author's philosophical framing relies on expanding our definition of the commons.
Like the oceans or the atmosphere.
Exactly. Under international law, we generally agree that no single nation is allowed to claim ownership of the open oceans, and no nation is allowed to monopolize the clean air in the atmosphere.
Because everyone needs them to live.
Right, because the basic survival of human life depends on those resources being shared. The author is taking that exact same existential logic and applying it to modern technology.
Because without semiconductors, without advanced grid batteries, without vaccine manufacturing, modern civilization literally collapses.
Therefore, these specific technologies cannot be viewed as the exclusive proprietary property of an economic empire. They belong in part to the global commons.
So, what does this all mean? Stepping back and looking at this massive, sweeping proposal, we have journeyed through an incredibly dense, controversial, and visionary framework today.
We really have.
The author is essentially arguing that humanity is standing at a fundamental philosophical crossroads regarding the nature of globalization.
The choice is stark. Is the global economy a shared marketplace governed by objective rules? Or is it simply a battlefield governed by conquest, where the strongest supply chain dictates terms to the weak?
If we accept that it's a battlefield, the author says we need to start pretending that global trade is about efficiency or comparative advantage. It is just empire building by other means.
But if we genuinely want it to be a marketplace, then monopoly dominance cannot be tolerated, whether it is perpetrated by a rogue corporation or by a sovereign superpower.
In the 20th century, humanity endured horrific wars, and in response, we had to build massive institutions like the United Nations to prevent military empires from conquering the globe by force.
And the author's concluding argument is that in the 21st century, the mechanism of conquest has just evolved. We must build new institutions to prevent the rise of economic empires.
Because unchecked supply chain monopolies are the new empires.
And it is crucial to recognize that the risk the author is warning about is not theoretical. It isn't some distant future scenario. We are watching the cracks form right now.
The escalating trade wars, the chip bans.
Yes, the weaponized tariffs, the frantic attempts at strategic decoupling. These are the real-time symptoms of a global system struggling to survive unchecked geopolitical monopolies.
And to connect this directly back to you, the listener, navigating your day-to-day life, every single device you touch, from the smartphone in your pocket to the computer in your car.
Every critical antibiotic or medication you might rely on.
The solar panels and batteries powering the renewable energy grid of the future. Every single piece of it currently relies on these incredibly fragile, hyper-concentrated, monopolized supply chains.
The transition of global power from military arsenals in the 20th century to economic choke points in the 21st century impacts the stability of your life on a daily basis.
The security of the world you live in is dictated by who holds those choke points.
And right now, nobody is regulating the people holding them.
We want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over today, something that builds on the sheer scale of what we've discussed. The author makes an incredibly compelling, highly logical case for a global supply chain treaty to enforce these automatic antitrust rules.
It really is, from an engineering perspective, a brilliant blueprint for redundancy and stability.
But there is a massive historical paradox here.
The paradox of power.
Exactly. Historically, the nations with the most power, the ones who hold the most leverage, are the exact same nations who write or have the power to veto global treaties.
Just look at the UN Security Council, where the 5 most powerful nations hold absolute veto power over any rules that might constrain them.
If absolute dominance over a supply chain is the 21st century equivalent of possessing a nuclear arsenal, How on earth do you convince the world's economic superpowers to voluntarily sign a treaty that legally requires them to disarm?
It is the ultimate puzzle of global governance. How do you enforce rules on the very nations who consider themselves the rule makers?
It really is. I mean, think back to our grocery store analogy at the very beginning. If a single grocery store controls the entire town's food supply, it is very easy for the townspeople to logically agree there should be rules preventing the owner from starving them.
But if that grocery store owner also happens to be the mayor, the judge, and the police chief?
Writing the law is a lot easier than actually enforcing it against them. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible systems that run the world around you, and we will see you next time.